Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wall Street Hackers, one of the most dynamic shows on the Pod TV network that goes over the economics relating to Wall Street and gives you very practical advice. And with that, we're going to bring in the Wall Street hacker himself, who is a graduate from UCLA, where he received a degree in economics. He also received a law degree from the University of Miami and also a master's in business administration from NYU, spending 17 years in the New York City or on Wall Street. None other than the hacker himself, Peter Bennett. And boy, we're in for a wild ride, it looks like this week. So take it away, Peter. Let us know how the markets are doing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A lot of volatility in the market, obviously, for anybody who's following it. We started our show a little later because we had a long lawyer's stand and then just a few minutes of technical difficulties. So you can usually catch a Wall Street Hackers around 6:15, 6:20. It will vary depending on the length of lawyer's stand. But we'll be on every Tuesday, almost every Tuesday, 6:15, 6:30 Eastern Standard Time on the regular distribution channels, including TikTok, Vimeo, Amazon Finance Groups, and Pod TV. Welcome to Wall Street Hackers, April 22nd, 2025. So first, our markets report. Wall Street Hackers stopped podcasting after about 2.5 years in mid-December because we basically said there's very little that we would recommend. On our final show, we did make some recommendations, and they've done pretty well, surprisingly, in this market. Anything that's surprising that does well in this market. But basically, our model portfolio is about flat in 1 or 2 good days, and I expect more for the things that we're holding. And we'll be up, which, again, I don't think many people can say that in this market, unless you're 100% in gold or something like that. So several things have happened since December. One, the overvalued market, which we said was very overvalued, is corrected. But even now, by historical standards, it's overvalued again, still. And so you have to be really cautious about your investment choices. Second, there was very sizable damage from DeepSeek. AI had led the markets for years, basically, and was supporting the markets. And almost all the profits were made in the Magnificent Seven and the AI companies. That motion froze and reversed especially because of the DeepSeek operation and the threat that it poses. Not to mention, I've always said AI is a little overrated. I mean, I talk to companies with AI and it's like, just get me a person. You can't even understand me a lot of times, but that's a separate issue. And then finally, of course, third item is President Trump, as discussed in the last show, is demanding fair trade rules from countries that have been using unfair trade rules against the United States for decades, and this has been a growing problem. So in the short term, this is causing economic disruption, and I believe it's necessary economic disruption to try to right the ship that is the United States that's lilting. But basically, you have to look at the medium term and the long term. But am I cautious in the market? Absolutely. I think this is the most important time to be cautious. So one of the effects of all this is Treasury rates are way up, which is also creating competition for equities. 2.5 years ago, you could get maybe 2.5%. Oh, no. Okay, so we're off? Are you saying get off and get back in?
You're still going, so keep on talking. You're still going on the show, so it's still, it hasn't ended. So I don't know what Nick's got going on, but keep your conversation going. It's still on.
So close this and go into a new link.
No, keep going. It hasn't ended. It's still going.
I don't understand. Okay, sorry, audience. We really are having technical difficulties today, but I'm told to keep going, so I'm assuming we're on. I thought it was going well. Anyway, sorry. Anyway. So in the short term, this is causing economic disruption. Of course it is. And I think the market is probably underestimating the disruption in the next few months because these companies are going to be faced with the question, pay the tariffs themselves, raise prices, which is going to hurt their sales or move manufacturing back to the United States, which is good for the United States, but is expensive for these companies. So I think the market is going to be a bit delusional about the ultimate effects of this in the short run. But again, in the long run, I have different feelings. So in the medium term, I like what's happening. I think, one, rates are very likely to come down, and we'll be discussing the Fed as our panel discussion with Nick towards the end of the show. Other countries' currencies and equities are likely going to be weaker because they're not going to be having the same trade advantages they had for years. So why would you say, oh, I'm going to get out of the dollar or out of U.S. Treasuries when rates are very likely to come down? Also, energy prices are already coming down and inflation is already coming down. So, and the president is getting rid of a lot of overburdensome regulations that will help the U.S. economy. So these are all factors where in the long run, I like the market. I like the head direction of the U.S. economy, and they have to deal with these major issues. Quote of the week. This comes from this week's in Barron's. Sorry. The number one threat to our nations right now is our debt, said House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier this year. We take this very seriously. Congress has kicked the can down the road for decades, and we're out of road. Exactly right. And this is the Speaker of the House. He is aware of it. And I think everybody is. They just don't want to tell the American public that in 10 years or 5 years, 7 years, Medicare is going to go off a cliff because there won't be funds in the trust funds anymore. And at that point, if we don't prepare, we're going to be printing more money than exists today by far. So this is a big issue. If you look at the U.S. economy using generally accepted accounting principles that every business and every U.S. household has to follow, and we're in about $125 trillion in debt. It's not the 36 trillion you hear every day. And the U.S. has to do as much as we can to start preparing for that, because 125 trillion is, get this, more money than the U.S. stock market, U.S. bond market, all privately held and commercially held real estate in the United States. It's basically everything. Basically, our assets equal our liabilities, and that leaves us with zero unless we print money, and we cannot be printing that much money. So you might say, okay, I'll move to other countries, but even if the United States didn't have this problem, the world is in a very similar situation. I've looked at countries around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, and every country I've looked at has almost identical problems, very significant problems, almost free healthcare offered to aging populations with very little put aside, and retirement plans that are about the same about the same underfunding as the United States. So that alone would cause a problem in the world, even if the United States wasn't 7 to 9 years from almost total disaster in terms of, it would be just so disruptive. So we need to take these steps now. Most interesting stories of the week segment. So this was interesting. It's from the New York Post, April 17th, 25. Astronomers have discovered a major sign of life and the first hints of an alien world on a distant planet orbiting outside our solar system. The scientists believe the exoplanet K2-18b is home to an abundance of a molecule that is produced on Earth only by living organisms such as marine algae. KB2-18b is 8 times the size of Earth, and they already knew that there was water vapor there. So not surprising, water vapor, energy, life. But this is the first time, these are the first hints that we're seeing an actual inhabited world. Of course, we're not talking about ET, and I wouldn't expect to get a visit from ET soon. Probably never. I hate to tell you that, if ET fans. But basically, there is life outside the Earth, and I think we prove it now. Next segment, why President Trump should give me a call segment. 2 weeks ago, we suggested President tell Vladimir Putin that if he won't make peace with Ukraine, we will increase our aid to Ukraine 15% every 2 months forever. Putin is already having economic problems, which I should go into in another show. I have an article. It's really his budget's getting super tight in terms of supporting his troops. But the point is, he seems to be reluctant, and there hasn't been a peace, and we need to put more pressure on him. And that would do it, because how many months of that would he take? And he would see the writing on the wall is time for peace. I think he's already starting to see that. Last week, we had a different suggestion. We talked about EVs that are either terrible for the environment and actually maybe worse than gas combustion engines, or close to it. Why? Study one, the average EV battery takes 500,000 pounds of minerals to be mined. Say that again, 500,000 pounds of mining to get one battery. That is not efficient. And that alone makes EVs questionable. But the second study said that EVs, because they're 10% heavier, burn a lot of tires and brakes. And those are petroleum products, and that creates pollution. Combine these two, and we might find out that EVs are actually terrible for the environment. So this week, I'm going to add to that suggestion and say President Trump should actually go for the fact that he is an environmental president. He has been historically. During his term, the air quality and CO2 in the world actually improved in the United States, and he made a lot of progress against it. Then when President Biden came in, for very specific reasons that we used to talk about, the U.S. and world CO2 went up steadily. I believe it was every year, and it was very dramatic, the increases in CO2. How could this happen? One, because Biden allowed more U.S. manufacturing to go overseas to countries that had very weak environmental regulations. It's one planet. The pollution from another country floats over here. And two, he stifled natural gas use, which led to the additional use in the U.S. and in Europe and other places, I imagine, more use of oil and coal. So natural gas has to be a transition fuel. And hopefully, I'm sure that we'll have more of that now. But President Trump should start grabbing that mantle. Okay, investment of the week. First, our disclosures. Wall Street Hackers is for entertainment only. There are no guarantees, of course, on any of our suggestions. These are only our opinions. Nobody can guarantee anything in finance except for a bond that's held to maturity, and then or CD. And also consult your financial advisor. So, for years, Wall Street Hackers' main focus is always on income producers. We really love dividend stocks, high dividend stocks, REITs, MLPs, and bonds. A lot of our studies show that is exactly the place to be historically. But this week, along with our large allocation to MPLX and high coupon long-term treasuries, which we've discussed in the last 2 weeks, we're going to talk about a 3.5% allocation to gold, GLD, which has obviously been doing great. First, the myth of gold. Many, if not most people believe, oh, gold is a great hedge against inflation, but it has a really mixed record as an inflation hedge. It did great in the 70s. It has occasionally done great. At other times, it's not an inflation hedge at all. And many studies show it has a very low correlation to inflation. So it's not necessarily the answer to inflation. However, we like gold for a few reasons. One, it serves as a diversifier. It's definitely a diversifier. Sometimes equities and bonds will head one way, the gold will be another. Two, it could do very well in a stagflationary environment. Given the world's and the United States' massive debts, we think that we most likely are heading towards stagflation, in which case interest rates may be low and inflation may be higher than interest rates. So gold could do well in that environment. And then finally, lower interest rates, which I believe countries in the world are going to have to force. Sooner or later, they're going to realize we can't pay interest on this massive debt. So we're going to have to use yield curve control. You can look that up, or we'll discuss it in another show too. But we're going to need zero or low interest rates around the world in order to avoid the interest on compounding on this massive amounts of debt. So in the end, it's speculative in nature. It doesn't produce income. But one way to look at it is if our moderate portfolio is generating about 5% yearly in income, then if we're throwing 3.5% into gold, it's a very low risk bet because we'll just make it up on income, and it does give diversity. But for each his own in terms of speculation and gold. So now we get to the panel question of the week, and we'll bring Nick on. Nick, come on.
I've arrived.
Hey, so the question of the week is, should the Fed lower interest rates? And does the Fed chairman know what he's doing? Or should he be fired, which is something that the president is talking about, but I don't know if he even has the power to do that. But first the background, and then we'll let Nick take a swing at this one. Background. The Fed chairman role may be one of the most difficult positions in all of government because the Fed has a dual mandate: control interest rates and control unemployment. That's not easy sometimes because you have different tools that might work on that. And also the Fed has very limited tools to work with. However, on the other side, the Fed and much of the market are probably looking at the high tariffs totally wrong when they think, oh, this is going to be massively inflationary. And Wall Street Hackers is pretty sure, and we've been pretty good about it, a lot of our other predictions in terms of the Fed, that we're going to get, because of this disruption, lower inflation and likely and possibly deflation. And the Fed should be maybe preparing for that. The disruptions from the tariffs, Deep Six, and market overvaluations will, I mean, I could say it certainly, will cause businesses and consumers to be cautious with their spending. And that will slow the economy. Economy 101 starts with supply and demand determines prices. So if you have a lot less demand, even if tariffs add some cost to things for the short run or maybe the long run, there's going to be adjustments in different directions. The Fed, by the way, has a long history of being behind the curve. Some people say for most of its existence, but not all of it. And recently, Wall Street Hackers, for years on our show, was saying that the Fed needed to raise interest rates, and they sat on low interest rates, and then we had way too high inflation. And then it was the market that was delusional, but the Fed was giving them signals that that was the right thing. Everybody's saying, oh, the Fed's going to lower, the Fed's going to lower. And Wall Street was accurate. They can't lower. They're not going to lower. And we were right about that too. So Wall Street Hackers, again, is predicting now that the Fed should be willing to just begin the process of lowering rates and then watch and see what happens. But they don't want to be too far behind the curve. So Nick, the question, should the Fed be lowering interest rates? Does the Fed chairman, who is keeping rates relatively high, know what he's doing, and or should he be fired? Nick?
Well, we can dismiss him being fired because the thing is, he's put in a position where basically one individual can't fire him. It has to be a whole collective of Congress and president. So he's not, Jerome Powell's not going to get fired. But now comes the question of interest rates being lowered. And I think the answer is yes, but mainly for this reason: the interest on the debt is $892 billion a year. And this is something that you've been arguing about. I agree with you, Peter. They have to lower the interest rates because as we're refinancing, $7 trillion or $9 trillion worth of debt into higher interest rates, that's going to keep our interest rates, our interest on the national debt going up and up and up. So the Fed is in a position where they have to lower the interest rates. The other thing is people can't afford anything. Over here in Spain, you know what the interest rate is if you borrow money to buy a house? 2 or 3%.
Wow.
That's all you pay, 2 to 3%. They've kept the interest rates here at 2 to 3% in the European Union. The United States, I looked at that because I'm looking to buy property there and buy property here. But if I borrow money over there, it's like 6, 7%. I mean, it's not even close. It's much better here than there. But that's my individual problem. The real problem is a macro problem, which we're seeing right now. It's the interest on the national debt, $892 billion a year. It's the largest budget item. So all the taxpayers are listening out this. Just think, your tax money is going to pay interest on a debt, which China and Japan are the number 1 and 2 debt holders. So your tax dollars are going hard to work in Japan and China.
Right, not a pretty picture. And to give you perspective, because those numbers are so massive, it's hard to get your hands on the fact $125 trillion, even the $36 trillion they say is, our debt, although it's really $125 trillion. So hard to get that. But the interest alone right now is more than the entire U.S. national defense budget. I mean, are we paying for defense or interest? And the problem is the rule of compounding. Basically, Einstein is attributed to this. I don't know if he said it or not, but he said the eighth miracle of the world is compounding. If you understand it, you control, you'll be wealthy or something like that. Sorry, I don't have the quote in front of me. But bottom line is, that's right. The interest will keep compounding, and it grows and grows and grows. And if you don't stop it, it keeps growing forever because it's compounding. So they have to get control of this debt. One way is through tariffs. Another way is through controlling spending, and cutting waste, as they're trying to do. But they're going to have to do much more than DOGE has been able to do so far. And so the bottom line is, as I said, I think the Fed has to begin lowering interest rates. We have to get there. We can't keep interest rates where they are for the next years because it's just adding to the national debt, which is a crisis that's occurring already. And it's going to get worse and worse. So should he be fired? I don't know. It's a tough job. It would be disruptive to some in the markets, although we've had some pretty poor Fed chairmen before, and it doesn't mean anything, but it would certainly shake confidence in the U.S. system, I suppose. So should he be fired? Hopefully not. But hopefully he will wake up and realize by May or June that rates need to come down. Mm-hmm. So thanks, Nick. And thanks for watching Wall Street Hackers. We'll be on next week around 6:15 Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, depending on how long Lawyer's Den goes. Usually it's about 15 or 20 minutes, so maybe we're talking about 6:15 and 6:20. As Kim always says, get healthy and get wealthy. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.